Hello, we are back here on the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast, yet another video slash audio edition. And today we're going to be talking about Tommy the Duke Morrison, also known as Tommy Gunn for those of you who have seen Rocky 5. So today's profile will obviously be about someone who is actually a character, literally a character in the Rocky movie, Rocky 5, which is by all accounts the worst Rocky movie. Sure, it has a cult following somewhere. It's a lot different than the rest of the Rocky movies, the original first five Rocky movies, and then, of course, you have Rocky 6 and then the following two Creed movies. But Tommy Morrison was the star of that movie. That kind of punches his ticket to the characters of boxing and beyond podcast, but he was a heck of a fighter, too. Let's not make any mistakes about it. Tommy Morrison rose to prominence after defeating George Foreman in 1993 to claim the vacant WBO heavyweight championship of the world. That fight taking place at the Thomas and Mack Center on the campus of UNLV in Las Vegas, Nevada, USA. So Tommy Morrison, Tommy Gunn, whatever you want to call him. He was from Oklahoma, although he was born in Arkansas. Technically, if you look at his what, according to what Wikipedia says, but he was raised in Delaware County, Oklahoma, which is in the middle of the country here in America, and it is Oklahoma is certainly a state that has um, one of the highest populations per capita, I believe, of Native Americans. And Tommy Morrison was born to a mother who was Native American. And I believe his father was of Scottish or European descent. And he definitely had the movie star looks, a very big heavyweight as in terms of muscles and muscle definition. He was a huge heavyweight in his day, and he according to what I was reading about him before when doing some show prep, he was in tough man competitions as a young lad. So tough man competitions, if you've ever listened to my episode that we did on Butterbean, the king of the four rounders, Butterbean was known for winning, and he was a normal guy, Butterbean, who had just had like a normal job and was also just dominant in tough man competitions, which are competitions that feature young amateurs, maybe not young. They have to be at least 21 years old. And from what I've read, Tommy Morrison, when he was as young, he claims when he was as young as 13, he used a fake ID to get into tough man competitions, which had a minimum age of 21. And according to Tommy Morrison, he was dominant in these tough man competitions at a young age. Tough man competitions are a way for guys who do not have an amateur technical training background who want to prove that they're tough dudes, and they get into these matches, and some people can make a name for themselves in these tough man competitions. Tommy Morrison did it as a young kid in order to, I guess, make some side cash. It's a good way to make side cash. But right now, it feels like tough man competitions are making a little bit of a comeback. I know that Barstool Sports is trying to promote these rough and rowdy competitions, which are, in essence, tough man competitions. So I'll keep my eye on that. I know there was a big tough man boom back in, like 2000, 1999 in the United States when you would see tough man competitions on TV, when you would see tough man video games come out. So keep your eye on that, whether or not tough man is, going to make a comeback here in America or the world, in general. So Tommy got his nickname. Of course, he's known as Tommy Gunn in the. I think his name was Tommy Machine Gun. Like his nickname was Machine in the movie Rocky Five. I'll be honest, I didn't. I've never watched Rocky Five from beginning to end. I've seen it on one of those like holiday weekend movie marathons that the USA Network used to have, and I'm sure I've watched parts of Rocky Five, but I've never seen the full movie. So I think his name was. Um, Tommy Machine Gun. His nickname was Machine, and his real name is supposed to be Gun in the movie. But his nickname in real life was Duke. The Duke, I think. Tommy the Duke Morrison? Yeah. Because according to Tommy Morrison, he was related to John Wayne. Now, that's never been confirmed, and there's been some skepticism around that. And of course, there's other parts of Tommy Morrison's life and career that were also up for debate, and we'll talk about that later. It's also the reason I'm wearing this West Virginia t shirt because when Tommy Morrison staged his comeback, and we will talk all about this in a little bit, he did fight in the state of West Virginia. But yeah, he claims that he was a descendant or a nephew or a great nephew of one of the most famous actors ever, John Wayne. So John Wayne was known as the Duke. Tommy claimed he was related to John Wayne, and he also went by the nickname the Duke. It's got a cool story behind it. It's not a kind of typical boxing nickname. It doesn't have to do, it's not Thunder Gotti because he throws a thunderous left hook. It's just kind of a different, cool character, definitely a character driven nickname. Now, whether or not Tommy Morrison really was related to John Wayne, I don't think we'll ever know, but hey, let's just take Tommy Morrison's word on this one. Maybe he was related to John Wayne. It's pretty cool if he was. But as we'll get to later, his untimely death did come in 2013. And as I alluded to just before, there was some conflicting reports about Tommy's health. And unfortunately, what would kind of be the ultimate final chapter in Tommy's life was the fact that he was HIV positive, and he claims that he never had AIDS. Many times he's claimed he didn't. Um, there has been blood tests that claim he did, and there have been blood tests that claim he didn't. So much like the John Wayne claim, we really won't know 100% for sure what the truth was there. If you had to ask me my opinion, I would say whatever the you know there's the thing that makes this impossible to weigh in an opinion on is there was literally conflicting blood tests, and I really can't say one way or the other. So we're just gonna have to leave that up to one of those mysteries of boxing. Although if you did look at the overwhelming evidence, I would say more than not, it was pointing to that he was in fact HIV, AIDS positive. And I'm not as versed on that whole story as I should be, but there is a 30 for 30 documentary from ESPN about Tommy Morrison that I encourage everyone to check out, that kind of goes into that a little bit more from a journalistic and reporting standpoint. And actually, this is not the first boxer we profiled on the Characters of Boxing podcast that has a 30 for 30 documentary about them. There is a really good 30 for 30 about Chuck Wepner that has been created. And there's also, spoiler alert here, folks, I think we'll plan to do an episode on a huge character from Columbus, Ohio by the name of Buster Douglas. I believe James is his real first name. James Buster Douglas, I want to say. Yeah, so we'll definitely have to do an episode on Buster Douglas. But all three of those individuals have had a 30 for 30, including Tommy Morrison. They've had a 30 for 30 documentary about their story. And if you're interested in more on that HIV conflicting blood test story, I really encourage you to read more about that. But Tommy the Duke was definitely a character literally starring in the movie Rocky Five. He also had another role in a movie that I'd never heard of, but it might have like a little bit of a cult following as far as what I have heard. It's a sci-fi movie, a thriller, a sci-fi movie directed by John Carpenter in 1988. It's called They Live. And John Carpenter, for those of you who don't know, I believe he was the one that did all the Halloween movies. So if you know Michael Myers and you know the Halloween movie franchise, which is obviously one of the most famous, maybe the most famous horror movie series that we have in America here, um, you know John Carpenter, that famous Halloween movie score music comes, directly to my mind when I think of that movie. And then apparently John Carpenter was also involved in Big Trouble in Little China, and then yeah, Escape from New York he did as well. And so Tommy Morrison was in this movie They Live. He must have done a great job in that movie. Like I said before, he had the movie star good looks. And the next thing you know, he's being invited to star in this Rocky Five movie. And at this point of Tommy Morrison's career, when Rocky Five comes out, this is about probably the movie came out in '90, so they probably filmed it in '89. And at that point, Tommy Morrison was like 20 and 0, 21 and 0, and he was knocking out everyone. You see a lot of knockouts in heavyweight boxing, and certainly in those, fights against prospects and stuff in his early fights. He was knocking out just about everyone. He was a rising star in boxing, and he caught Hollywood's attention. Chuck Wepner, who we've done a podcast on as well. I'm sorry, not Chuck Wepner. Randall Tex Cobb, who we've done a podcast about as well, caught Hollywood's attention for the opposite reason. His looks were so gruff and scary looking that he was cast as a villain in a ton of movies and television shows. Tommy Morrison was a good looking movie star type look guy, and he caught Hollywood's attention when he was like 20 and 0 as a fighter. And next thing you know, he's in this Rocky Five movie, solidifying himself as an all-time character of boxing. That's why he's on this podcast. That's why we're discussing him today. His first loss came in a TKO to Ray Mercer in '91. So after that movie came out, to horrible reviews, very least popular Rocky movie by far, I believe. Next thing you know, and Tommy Morrison never was in any other movies that I know of after that. So, he's kind of done with Hollywood, and Rocky Five's a flop, and then he loses to Ray Mercer. So things in his life kind of start to take a tailspin. Let's be honest. Losing that first fight is never easy. It can put you into a massive depression. Um, I know that we did an episode on Ricky Hatton when he lost his first fight to Pretty Boy Floyd in 2007, I think that was. He went into a huge depression because it's just something you never taste. You haven't tasted it as a professional, and it changes kind of maybe your identity, how you feel about yourself. It changes your confidence. It can really play with your mind, your first loss. And Tommy Morrison's first loss comes at a time that he just had a movie that flopped and he never starred in a movie again. So maybe his performance was, people weren't pleased with it. Hollywood wasn't pleased with it. Certainly, box office numbers weren't there, so that affected his chances at ever starring in another movie again. This difficult time in his life is really starting to hit in the early '90s. But like many people's lives, it's full of ups and downs, and life can be a roller coaster. And it certainly was a roller coaster in the case of Tommy Morrison, because he just when he's hitting that super low point, losing to Ray Mercer, he you don't never count him out, because by 1993 he's fighting for the WBO heavyweight title, because he gets that first loss under his belt in '91, and then he comes back with some serious victories, strings together, about 7 or 8 straight victories, beating the likes of Art Tucker, Joe Hip, Carl Williams, and next thing you know, he's fighting George Foreman for the heavyweight championship of the world in June of 1993. Folks, I can remember this time period. I am, born in '86, the tail end of '86, December 22nd, '86. So I can remember like the how George Foreman in the early '90s was like one of the biggest stars in boxing. I mean, you're talking about a guy who was like everyone was just so amazed at this. I mean, no disrespect to George Foreman by saying this, but he was like a relic from fighting in the '70s. This relic from the '70s. This guy who fought Muhammad Ali, who was so tough. He made this incredible career comeback in the early '90s, and he was the man. And Tommy Morrison beats him in 1993. And just like we say, life can be a roller coaster. Life turns around for your boy Tommy the Duke Morrison, beating George Foreman for that WBO championship. And then, um, unfortunately, he would go on to lose it 2 fights later in actually a first round TKO to an individual named Michael Bent. And that fight against Bent actually happened in Tommy Morrison's home state of Oklahoma. That's got to sting. You come to Oklahoma trying to defend that heavyweight championship belt, and boom, drops the belt to Bent. And Ben is best known for co-starring as Sonny Liston in the 2001 film Ali. There's another actor. So he drops the belt to another future actor um, at the convention center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then life would really take a turn for Tommy Morrison. And I'm talking about an event that happened in 1996, and it is the whole reason that there is a 30 for 30 documentary out there about Tommy Morrison. And this event happened after after he loses the IBC heavyweight title to Lennox Lewis, which he drops in October of 1995. Um, after losing that WBO title, he actually wins the IBC heavyweight title in Kansas City over a guy named Razor Ruddock, a Canadian who you might be familiar with. He TKOs Ruddock, then drops the belt to Lewis. Again, the roller coaster of life really taking place there for Tommy Morrison. But unfortunately, the biggest event in Tommy Morrison's life would happen outside the ring. And it wouldn't, I don't, from what I've read on Tommy Morrison, this more than any obviously loss in the ring put him in the worst place as far as his mental health and the depression. And he went into a real dark place when in 1996 he announced, I think it was in an ESPN interview, that he was in fact HIV positive. Now, this is something that we've seen in professional sports before. Um, Arthur Ashe had, I believe, he had the AIDS virus that he got from a blood transfusion. He was an all-time great tennis player, and the U.S. Open tennis court is named after him. And the main court at the U.S. Open in New York City is named Arthur Ashe Stadium. And of course, Magic Johnson from the L.A. Lakers, and I believe it's 1991, came out as HIV positive. So we've seen this in sports before, and it never ceases to shock. And it was certainly in the '90s, in the late '80s as well. It was something that would pop up, and it was always a dark time. So Tommy, when this would happen, so Tommy announces to the world in 1996 that he has AIDS. I'm sorry, he's tested positive for HIV. Now I'm not a medical expert, but but testing positive for HIV does not necessarily means you have the AIDS virus. So I I cannot go any more in depth medically. My fiance's mom actually works with has worked for a long time with she's a doctor physician, so I should have her on the podcast before I say anything more or pretend I know anything more. But she would know. She's worked with plenty of patients that are HIV positive. So you know this event happens in 1996. The Nevada State Athletic Commission, says he's HIV positive. He has to pull out of a big fight, and we don't really hear from Tommy Morrison. Sadly, or whatever, however you want to say it, it's kind of sad. We don't really hear from Tommy Morrison after that, as far as his boxing career. Now there was a fight that Tommy Morrison actually did have in the 90s, in 1996. That same year he announced he was HIV positive. He has a fight in 1996 in Japan. Now, before, as a boxer, his career goes on this hiatus, he has a fight in 1996 in Japan against a fighter named Marcus Rody. Um, and this fight takes place in Japan because in America, in the United States, and I'm not positive if this rule is still in place in the United States, but certainly was in 1996, and it definitely was in 2007, like we'll soon talk about. But in the U.S., there's a law, I guess, that the commissions have. I think all the state commissions have it. All 50 state commissions have it, that you can't fight. You can't be sanctioned to fight if you have HIV, if you're HIV positive, because the way that HIV is spread is through the blood. So if someone has an open wound and a bloody eye, whatever, how boxing is. There could possibly be a blood. This thing passed through the blood in boxing. Now, there is other reports. I think doctors have noted that this actually wouldn't. I don't know. Again, I don't want to talk about the medical side of things because I will be having no clue what I'm talking about. I'm going to stick to my core competency here, which is boxing and characters. So the bottom line is although I guess there's been no documented cases of someone getting HIV positive through boxing, but they do not allow you to fight in the United States if you're HIV positive. So he goes to Japan and fights this guy Marcus Rody in a bout that was supporting the new foundation that I think Tommy Morrison had started, but for AIDS research or HIV research or something like that. It was a charity to work with finding the cure, I believe. So there was a charitable bout that he had while he was HIV positive that was sanctioned in Japan because they can't hold it in the United States, coming in 1996. And in that fight, the ref, I got a chance to watch it. It's a quick fight. It ends in the first round in a TKO, and they're saying in the fight that Tommy Morrison just wants to get his anger out. He feels depressed. He wants to do something. So he flies to Japan and fights this guy. He beats him up in the first round. It's ugly, but it's all for charity. And in the fight, the ref is wearing a Keith Haring shirt. So Keith Haring is a really popular, one of my favorites. I really like Keith Haring's artwork. He's a very popular pop artist who died in 1990, who had the HIV/AIDS virus, and he did a lot of activism, awareness for AIDS and AIDS, and he was big in pop culture. He does the drawings that are like stencils of dogs and stick figures, and there's a lot of political overtones to his work. And he's a big presence in New York City. There's artwork off the FDR if you're ever driving. I believe it's off the FDR if you're ever driving in New York, in Manhattan. I think he has a big mural that he did there. It was I think he says crack is whack. So he was, this was a time when there was a crack epidemic in the United States, crack cocaine epidemic. So Keith Haring, I'm sorry I had to talk to you about Keith Haring. You go off on that tangent because I love art, and I'd love you to learn more about Keith Haring. I encourage you to read more about him. But the point was, the ref in this fight, in this Tommy Morrison fight in 1996, is wearing a Keith Haring shirt in support, I believe, of the charity that Tommy Morrison was trying to raise money for, which was interesting. I've never seen a boxing referee wear a T-shirt with a Keith Haring drawing on it, and I think it was like a stick figure, like fighting the kind of just trying to fight off the AIDS virus. It was really an interesting sight to see this whole fight too take place. But so in 1996, after that charitable fight, he does shut it down. He stops fighting professionally, and if you look at his record on boxrec.com or Wikipedia or however you consume your boxing encyclopedia, because there's plenty of options out there. But if you do look on his record, he has a huge vacancy, and he doesn't fight again until 2007. Now, in 2007, I was sitting in a college dorm room in Morgantown, West Virginia. That is why I'm wearing a West Virginia University t-shirt today, as we shoot this video for YouTube and as we record it for the podcast here. I sat in my dorm room, and I remember my college roommate, he came into the room and said, he had a newspaper or he was reading it online and said, "Hey, Tommy Morrison's been cleared to fight in West Virginia at a casino that was maybe about a 45-minute hour drive from Morgantown." And, it was just cool that I happened to be in West Virginia when this was a huge national story, international story, that West Virginia had cleared. The state of West Virginia had cleared Tommy Morrison's to fight. Tommy Machine Gun was going to fight again, and it was going to take place in West Virginia. While I was there, and it was pretty fascinating. That was when I started to read about Tommy Morrison, because I didn't remember him as, I remembered Foreman, like I said earlier when I was a kid, but I didn't remember Tommy Morrison too much as a fighter. And I remember starting to read about him, and it was really fascinating that this guy at 38 years old was going to get back in the ring. And, the most bizarre, the reason that this story became so popular, the reason there's a 30 for 30 about this story is because Tommy Morrison claims that his original HIV test that was a false positive, which meant it was wrong, that it ended up being wrong, that he really didn't have HIV. And apparently this was cleared by a couple different states when he had like 4 negative tests in a row for HIV in 2007. And so it just was really strange. There was conflicting reports and conflicting blood test results, and it just became a really fascinating story and had a lot of questions to it. But in the end, West Virginia was the state where where his comeback was going to take place. It would be the 51st fight of his career, and it would take place at the Mountaineer Casino Racetrack and Resort in Chester, West Virginia, which, if you've ever seen an outline of West Virginia, Chester, West Virginia, or wherever this racetrack and resort is where this fight took place, is about maybe, I don't know, it's 45 an hour from Pittsburgh. It's at the top of West Virginia. It's called the Northern Panhandle there in West Virginia, and near Ohio, between Ohio and Pennsylvania, and that's where Tommy Morrison's career would come back. And I was reading a little bit about it. There's a Dan Rayfield story about it that's still available on ESPN.com, and it seems like this fight was scheduled to be a part of a versus televised fight. So Versus was this network in the United States that had a lot of like outdoor shows and some sports. There was like some motorsports involved on it. Versus is no longer around, to my knowledge. But this was a televised bout that was going to take place, and Morrison was going to be on this card, but his bout was not scheduled to take place. Now, I wish I could tell you I was there that night in West Virginia, but I was a broke college kid. I didn't have a car. There was no chance I was going to that one. But I would have watched it if it was would have been one of those televised fights on Versus. But it was not televised. They only showed highlights of the fight later, I believe, on Versus from according to that Dan Raphael article that I just referenced. So he fights John Castle in West Virginia in February of 2007. That was about a month or two before West Virginia won the NIT. West Virginia basketball won the NIT National Invitation Tournament that year. I remember I went to a couple of those games, but bringing back good memories. But so John Castle, he defeats in a TKO in this comeback fight, and then he fights one more time in Mexico in 2008, and he wins that one as well. So John Castle, I don't know much about him as a fighter. I don't think he had any sort of stellar career, and those wins were, I don't know how valuable they were because I don't know the quality of the guys he beat in his two comeback fights in 2007 and 2008. But hey, he won both of them. Can't take that away from the guy. He gets two TKO victories. And unfortunately, Tommy Morrison's life would not last too much longer after his comeback fights in 2007 and 2008 when he's 38, 39 years old. He's approaching the age of 40 in these comeback fights. But his life would end tragically because of how young he was. He was 44 years old. Tommy Morrison, raised in Delaware County, Oklahoma. Certainly Oklahoma has a proud sporting history. Mickey Mantle is from the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma football, maybe the most legendary collegiate football program in America. And of course, that's up for a big time debate. But Oklahoma has a very very proud sporting history, and Tommy Morrison certainly represented Oklahoma. And it's from Delaware County, which is very rural part of Oklahoma, in the north eastern portion of the state. But unfortunately, Tommy Morrison would die in 2013, so not that long ago, Tommy Morrison did pass away. Sadly, tragically, he had cardiac arrest resulting from a multi-organ failure. So this was due to septic shock and just caused by an infection. So I don't know if that was related to the possibility that he had AIDS. Of course, he said he didn't have AIDS. His mom said he did have AIDS. There's a whole documentary kind of that goes into this, as I've referenced. But there is one last thing I will mention before we wrap up today's episode. I want to leave you on a positive note. He was a great character of the ring. Tommy Morrison, he is starring in those two motion pictures in the late 80s and early 90s. A John Carpenter movie he was in. Check that movie out. I got to write that down later. He was in, what was it called? They Live. Let's see if that's any good and see how big a role Tommy Morrison had. He was in the Rocky Five. Unfortunately, his life comes to a very, very short end. Comes to a sudden end. And one thing I will leave that is on a positive note is Tommy Morrison is survived by two sons, Trey and Kenzie. And Trey and Kenzie, I don't know how old they are. I didn't get to read too much about them, but I will say this: they're two young lads of Tommy Morrison. I don't know how old they are, so I'm not sure if they're up and coming still or whatever. But they did follow in his footsteps, and they are making it. They are at this point trying to make a name for themselves as professional boxers. So hopefully Trey and Kenzie can carry that legacy on of Tommy the Duke Morrison, because That would be awesome if they could fight for their dad's memory, and if their fights ever get on TV, hopefully the TV will show a nice montage of their dad and give him give a tribute to his dad, because that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to remember the fact that he did beat Razor Ruddock in 1995 to win the heavyweight championship. He won the WBO heavyweight championship in 1993. Let's not forget about these incredible you know athletic feats that this heavyweight champion, this two-time heavyweight champion of the world, Tommy Morrison was able to do in his short life that was, tragically ended so young. So that's been today's episode of the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. I'm glad you were able to join us. I'm glad we were able to talk about another character of the ring today.